Hey everyone, so on my previous video comparing the OnePlus Open to the Pixel 8 Pro's camera, I came to the conclusion that the OnePlus Open does in fact have a flagship level camera. However, in the comments of that video, I was asked about comparing the iPhone 15 Pro Max and the S23 Ultra with the OnePlus Open. Unfortunately, I couldn't get my hands on an iPhone 15 Pro Max, but I did get an S23 Ultra to be able to compare with the OnePlus Open. So this is not going to be exactly the same as the last video because I already came to the conclusion that the OnePlus Open does in fact have a true flagship camera. This is more to see how closely it compares to the Samsung S23 Ultra because we already got a video of how it compares to the Pixel 8 Pro. The first thing I want to cover is just the hardware itself to see how they compare, and I'll shoot off the stats real quick. For the main sensor, the OnePlus Open has a 48 megapixel 0.70 inch sensor, and the S23 Ultra has a 200 megapixel 0.77 inch sensor. For the ultra-wide, the OnePlus Open has a 48 megapixel 0.5 inch sensor, and the S23 Ultra has a 12 megapixel 0.39 inch sensor. And finally, moving to the telephoto, the OnePlus Open has a 64 megapixel 0.5 inch sensor, and both of the Samsung S23 Ultra telephoto / periscope lenses have the same specs at 10 megapixels and 0.28 inch sensors. Now let's look at some of the sample photos that I was able to take, and for these sample photos, I actually was able to go to the zoo and take some pretty good pictures. And with the zoo, a lot of the animals are actually pretty far, so it really put a lot of strain on the telephoto lenses. So I'll just roll through the photos with each phone and kind of compare the samples from the similar images that I took. The first photo that we're looking at is an ultra wide, and there are a lot of objects to kind of look into and see if there's any extra detail. So between the two images, I don't see too much additional detail on either of the pictures. The only thing I could kind of point out a little bit is that little barrier to keep the animals in. It looks like it has the slightest more detail with the OnePlus Open's ultra wide versus the S23 Ultra's ultra wide, but it's not a lot more. And when I look at the grass and the tree trunks, I'm not seeing any extra detail on either one. So at that point, it's really more of a preference on which color science you like better. But the thing with ultra wide is that it's really made to capture the full view of something, not to have a lot of detail per se. When you zoom out, really both photos do look really good. I wouldn't even give an edge to either phone. So the next image is in the exact same spot, but with the main sensor. And even though the Samsung has a larger sensor with more megapixels, it looks like it has slightly less detail when I zoom in a lot versus the OnePlus Open. It's only a slight amount, and I know that Samsung is really holding back on the sensor's potential just because 200 megapixel photos are huge and take a longer time to process. But just default to default, it looks like the OnePlus Open has the slightest bit more detail, but not enough to really make that much of a difference, and that's something that you will notice without zooming in. The next photo moves over to the 3x sensor for both phones, and on this one there is a difference. So I've always noticed that the S23 Ultra's 3x sensor is really the weak point of the camera system. Even though the 10x has the same sensor, just the fact that it's optical compared to the competitors having to zoom in 2x digital just to catch up, it's still better overall. But the 3x sensor is not the best that I've seen, and these samples show it here. The OnePlus Open 3x photo looks quite a bit better than the S23 Ultras. Just cropping in to the tree trunks and the tree branches, you see more detail on the OnePlus Open, and a little bit with the monkey as well. So the next photo is the same sensor, but I want to test it out because it uses OnePlus's in-sensor crop, and so I thought it would be a good test to compare the two 3x sensors at 6x. Looking at the results, I will say that the S23 Ultra didn't really fall behind like I expected it to. So I give kudos to Samsung on that one, since even though the sensor is smaller, it didn't just crumble by zooming in a bit more, which is also very important because the 3x has to cover a lot of ground before it gets to 10x. Don't get me wrong, the difference in quality is there and noticeable. The OnePlus has more detail, and it did take a little bit of a bigger lead, but not as much as I expected. The next photo is changing the sensor on the S23 Ultra to the 10x. So it's optical zoom for the Samsung and pure digital zoom for the OnePlus Open. And obviously it's going to be reversed where Samsung is going to have more detail, but I am happy with how OnePlus handled and didn't, again, like just like Samsung didn't crumble when cropping in with the 3x, OnePlus didn't crumble going up to 10x with their 3x, which is pretty impressive. Now, obviously, Samsung did get the upper hand here. Just, it makes total sense. It's pretty much starting at zero, basically zero digital zoom. So it's going to get more detail, and it shows. You see it in this photo. So definitely 10x, and I would imagine anything above that, which we'll see on the next photos, Samsung is gonna take the win. And with this last photo of this monkey that patiently waited till I finished everything before moving, the OnePlus again surprises me how well it does at 30x. Obviously, it's not as good as the lower zoom photos, but I feel like if you don't crop in, it looks like a usable photo. It could be that it's very busy with a lot of leaves, so maybe it hides a lot of the imperfections, but I'm surprised at how decent it looks. And then when we go to Samsung, for sure, it still looks all right. 3x, yeah, you'll get some degradation from the pure optical 10x, but you know, a 3x zoom, digital zoom on that lens is gonna be the same thing as a 3x zoom on the 3x lens, except you're way further. Yeah, so that 30x on the Samsung is ridiculous. The fact that I feel like it's a usable phone and you can actually crop in a little bit more and it still looks alright. It's just that's Samsung's game right there, that 10x optical zoom. Alright, so this next photo is just of a colorful tree there. I didn't even read what it was about, but mainly I just wanted to test out the high res options for these phones, which for the OnePlus, the high res is 48 megapixels, and then for Samsung is that ridiculous 200 megapixels, which I do believe makes a difference. And so first, let's look at the OnePlus, which you are able to crop in quite a bit and you can see things pretty clearly. You do get some additional detail, but I've noticed with a lot of phones, going from the 12 megapixel to the 48 megapixel resolution for these photos doesn't make as much of a difference as I thought it would. It does a little bit, and you do get more extra details and all these different things, but it's just not as much as I would think. However, when you go to Samsung, when you start off at 12 and then you have the option for 50 and then finally at 200. For starters, I think that the 50 megapixel resolution on the Samsung is a little bit better. You get a little bit more detail. This is just the slightest, but you do get a little bit more than the other ones, including OnePlus. I feel like they do like the best job with the high resolution photos. And then obviously, once you get to 200 megapixel, it's in its own world. I guess the biggest issue with the 200 megapixel photo is that it takes 43 megabytes on the photo that I'm showing here to back up to Google Photos, which that's the equivalent of about 8 other 12 megapixel photos. So you do take a hit on storage with these 200 megapixel photos. Also, it does take a little bit longer to take the picture, but if you do have the time and space, these 200 megapixel photos are pretty ridiculous. If you take that 200 megapixel photo, you can easily crop in to maybe 4 times, 5 times, and still have a high quality photo, which is pretty crazy. Besides that, just the amount of detail you get extra compared to the other resolution photos is quite substantial. In fact, reading the sign on the tree, which is actually pretty small, I think it can be read a bit with the 50 megapixel versions of both phones, but it's pretty blurry. But with the 200 megapixel, it's actually really clear. So it's not something that you're going to be able to tell without cropping in too much, but it would help for anyone who is familiar with editing photos and getting the most out of them. It will give you more options. And obviously, if you want to crop in, you kind of want to go that route. So I mean, in terms of high-res photos, Samsung definitely takes it on this one. So now we got the basics covered. I want to show the weakest photos or the biggest difference in photos between the two phones that I took that day. And the first one is of these two rhinos that are facing each other. This is using the 10x on the Samsung and then obviously the 3x on the OnePlus, and it's zoomed in pretty far. I think it was something like 15 times zoom. This one shows how much Samsung can really run away with it when there's a lot of detail in the photo. Starting with the OnePlus, it looks pretty good if you don't crop in, but if you zoom in a little bit and look at the faces of the rhinos, they look very bland. There's not much detail on them. Yeah, overall it's a pretty decent photo considering it's so far, but there is a reduction of detail there that you can notice. Now if you go to Samsung's, we're on the same zoom, and if we crop in to the face, you see a lot more detail. You see more color in the faces of the rhinos, discoloration, which you couldn't really tell too much in the OnePluses because it was kind of all smoothed out. So this really shows how much extra detail you get from Samsung's 10x telephoto lens or periscope lens. I also took a 100x photo. Obviously these are terrible photos, but I just wanted to see how far behind the OnePlus is at these extremes. So at 100x, the OnePlus does again have a lot less detail, but the Samsung looks like it has issues with the color at that range. So obviously neither one is perfect, but Samsung's has way more detail than OnePlus is. This next photo shows a little bit of the weakness of pretty much a lot of sensors or a lot of lenses that are 5x or larger, where in some scenarios the bright colors, usually like a white or a very light gray, kind of have this look to them, like if you're looking at the photo with astigmatism kind of thing. I don't know why it does it. It might just be that I can't handle the reflection of the sun off of something very light, but this is one of the examples that I've come across. And so this is the Samsung's 10x sensor. You can see around the ears of this animal where the color looks like it's flowing over the ear, like it's not being kept where it's supposed to be. And if you look at the OnePlus's version, yeah, it's not as detailed as the Samsung, but the color looks more accurate and is staying where it's supposed to be. So the next two sets of photos I'm going to show are kind of going to show the limits of Samsung's 3x lens. And it's kind of like when it reaches close to the limit before it switches to the 10x lens. So with the OnePlus, you can see, I feel like you can see every strand of fur on the camel's side and on the hump. But when you go to Samsung, you don't have that detail. Obviously, I'm zooming in pretty far with the 3x, but really both phones are using a 3x. It just goes to show how the OnePlus's 3x is superior to Samsung's, being that it's a substantially larger sensor and it has more megapixels to be able to do the pixel binning or cropping in or whatever it wants to do. And then the next example is, it looks like the species is related to a llama, but I know it's not a llama because I remember commenting on it. So with this one, the llama's behind the rock, so it's kind of hard for the camera to decide what to focus on, and it's actually pretty hard to tap on the screen because the llama's pretty small compared to everything else on there, since the whole animal's not exposed. And when you crop in with the OnePlus, you can see that there's more detail. The llama is not as clear as I would like it to be, but it's still like a decent photo. And when we look at the Samsung's picture, it's using the 3x lens at a higher zoom level than I would want to use it really, and it didn't quite reach the 10x lens. And this shows the weakness of that 3x lens. If you zoom in a little bit, you can see that there's just so much less detail on the llama and the things around it, that the 3x lens is on the OnePlus Open is a clear winner between these two phones. So the type of videos that I took were while I was walking, and I wanted to see how good the stabilization is on the OnePlus compared to the Samsung, because I know that to me Samsung has the best stabilization on any Android. I can't really account for iPhone. I know it's good on the iPhone, I just haven't really compared it one-to-one. But let's take a look at these videos and see how well the OnePlus compares. So first, looking at the OnePlus, it does look very good. There's the slightest bobble up and down, which is expected when using the regular stabilization. I'm using the action mode. And then as I zoom into the 3x lens, it still keeps the slight bob, so that's good. It's not going crazy. The only thing is that we get a little bit of extra distortion in the video. Looking at Samsung's video, again, you do see that the bobble, because obviously I'm walking, so you're gonna notice like the wall next to me going up and down, but it looks just a little bit steadier. And neither phone had distortion in the main sensor. So as we zoom in to the Samsung's 3x sensor, you see that it kind of retains the good video quality and the good stabilization with I didn't notice any distortion. Now, as I zoom into the 10x sensor, again, it still keeps a pretty good stabilization, better than I expected, but there is an increase in the amount of distortion in the video. It makes sense that there's some additional distortion even with Samsung with that 10x sensor, because when you zoomed in that far, every little movement you make as a cameraman is multiplied on the video when you're zoomed in so far. So I'm not surprised that there is some distortion, but I am happy that it did keep a fairly steady video even at 10x. Now comparing the camera apps, they actually both have very similar options on the photo. I do have the latest update of One UI, so I do like the settings better on Samsung, which is basically brand new, but I really do like the way it is. It lays everything out, all the important things out on top and quickly changeable. With OnePlus, a lot of good ones are up top, but for other things like HDRs, aspect ratio, these different things, you have to click on the hamburger menu and kind of go in there, which is not too bad. It's actually fairly simple in there, but it's still an extra step. Now, when we move on to video, it's the same story basically, where the settings up top are pretty similar, but with the update, Samsung does give you a couple of extra important settings up top that you could quickly toggle. Another difference is that OnePlus has the portrait video in here. So instead of having its own option for portrait video, you have to click on video and then click on the portrait icon on the left side to activate portrait video. Whereas with Samsung, portrait video has its own option. Another thing to note with the portrait video is that Samsung has the ability to shoot at Ultra HD and OnePlus is limited to 1080p. So that actually is a pretty big deal. If you shoot in 4K and you want to shoot a portrait video, you can't keep the same quality with OnePlus. You have to downgrade to 1080p. Whereas Samsung, you can keep the same quality across all your videos. Another thing is that while you're actually recording, the zoom in and zoom out process or action is a little different. With Samsung, you have it like most other phones where it has your levels laid out. Your 0.6, 1, 3, and 10x. And then you could also touch and hold and then drag your finger to zoom in and out manually with your finger. With OnePlus, you're limited to using that bar, which I do like to use that bar whenever I am zooming in a video because it keeps it very steady, almost like a professional looking video. It's not perfect, so it doesn't look 100% professional, but it does give you a closer to professional feel in the video. It's a bit hard to stop on the 1x and 3x exactly, so a lot of times I will end up stopping at like 1.1 or 2.9, which is the worst one. If I stop at 3.1 and 1.1 is not a big deal, 2.9, you're not getting the same quality. So there are some downsides to that, but I do like the slider. It would be cool if we had both options of using the slider and the tap option. Now, Samsung does have the ability to zoom in by sliding on a bar as well in their Pro video mode. The limitation on that I noticed is that you can't switch lenses. You're only zooming in with that bar on the lens that you started recording on. So it's not quite a one-to-one with the OnePlus's bar. Now, navigating through both of the apps is actually very similar. It looks almost identical when you're looking at them side by side. Samsung has the modes and then lets you change the settings in it. Like for example, photo mode, you can actually change it from 12 megapixel to 50 megapixel to 200 megapixel. Whereas with OnePlus, if you want to shoot at 50 megapixel, you have to go to the high res setting. So that one actually takes a bit longer, and you cannot zoom in, you cannot crop in digitally before taking the photo. You have to take the photo and then crop in afterwards. So with OnePlus, when you're in high res, you're shooting at the base zoom level for each sensor. But with Samsung, when you go to 200, you're stuck with the first sensor, obviously because that's the only one that could go 200, but you can zoom in digitally before taking the photo. I guess that brings up another benefit to OnePlus, is that since all their sensors have a high megapixel count, you can go to high res and take a high res picture with each one of their sensors. That's a big benefit, especially if you want to take an ultra wide and you do want to get extra detail, or if you want to take a zoomed in high res picture. So basically my findings are that with the ultra wide, they're pretty much even. I don't see that the OnePlus is benefiting too much from having the larger sensor, at least not in the photo that I took. On the main sensor, on the default mode, OnePlus looks like it has a little bit of extra detail, but it's not really anything that's going to set it apart. However, you do have the option with Samsung to shoot 200 megapixel, and that is leagues above the other phones. With the 3x sensor, OnePlus has a clear advantage there, where it is getting extra detail. As you get closer to that 10x sensor on Samsung, it just falls behind more and more. Now, it doesn't fall behind as much as I expected, but you can clearly see that OnePlus has the better 3x sensor. And then finally, Samsung has a 5x sensor, which I'm not gonna say the sensor is better than OnePlus's, because it's really not. It's just the fact that it starts at 10x. But either way, the lens itself, the 10x option is a better option. Obviously stands on its own because OnePlus doesn't have a fourth sensor to look at. Really, overall, it's kind of hard to say one is clearly better than the other. Really depends on what you're looking for. I think OnePlus has a steadier range where it's going to be good from, you know, the ultra wide all the way to basically 10x. And then Samsung goes from a good ultra wide to a really good main to a weak 3x to a 10x that, you know, is pretty much the best that's available from the phones that I've used. So there you have it. I can't really choose one because they kind of go back and forth, but I'm actually surprised at how well OnePlus performed. I hope you found the video helpful. I hope that the samples showed what I was explaining. And if you have any questions or comments, don't hesitate to leave them in the comment section. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And as always, I'll see you in the next one.